My sister ruins every relationship with my father after our mother cheated on him because she still hopes that my father can get her back. My mom cheated on my dad. That's the short version. It wasn't some big dramatic reveal with yelling and slamming doors, at least not at first. I found out because I overheard my dad on the phone one night, voice shaking, asking her why she did it. She didn't even deny it. She just packed a couple bags, said she was done, and left us behind. Me, my little sister, and my dad just abandoned us like we were nothing. I was 15, my sister was 12, and my dad was suddenly stuck raising 2 kids on his own. He didn't take it well, but who would? He'd been with my mom for almost 20 years, built a whole life with her, and then she just walked out. For a while, he tried to keep things normal for us. He'd still make breakfast, drive us to school, ask about our day. But you could tell he was broken. His eyes were always red, and he'd sit in the living room late at night staring at nothing. My sister didn't see it that way though. She had this idea that it was somehow his fault, like he drove mom away by not being good enough. She was always mom's favorite growing up. Mom used to call her my little princess when she was a kid, brushing her hair, buying her dresses, all that stuff. I think that stuck with her. Even after mom left, my sister acted like she had to defend her. She'd say things like dad argued with mom too much, or he didn't try hard enough to keep her happy. It didn't matter that mom was the one who cheated, she still blamed him. I tried to tell her it wasn't his fault, but she'd just roll her eyes and walk away. That's where the divide started, I guess. Me and dad on one side, her on the other. Things got worse between my sister and my dad pretty fast after mom left. She wasn't just sad about the family splitting up, she was angry, and all that anger landed on him. I think part of it was because she spent so much time with mom growing up. They had this bond one never really got. Mom would take her shopping or to the park, just the two of them, while I stayed home with dad fixing cars or playing video games. So when mom cheated and walked out, I think my sister felt like she lost her best friend. And instead of blaming mom, she turned it on dad. She started disobeying him over little things at first. He'd tell her to do her homework, and she'd lock herself in her room instead. He'd ask her to clean up after dinner, and she'd leave her plate on the table without a word. It wasn't loud rebellion, she didn't yell or scream, but it was constant. Every time he tried to set a rule, she'd ignore it like he didn't matter. I could see it wearing him down. He'd sigh, rub his face, and mutter something about how he didn't know what to do with her. I tried talking to her once, asking why she was so mad at him. She just said he should have fought harder to keep mom around. She didn't care that mom was the one who cheated. She kept saying dad wasn't good enough, that he let the family fall apart. It didn't make sense to me, but she wouldn't listen. She'd always been stubborn, but this was different. It was like she'd decided he was the enemy, and nothing was going to change her mind. Meanwhile, I was stuck watching them drift further apart every day. After a couple years of this mess, my dad finally started pulling himself together. He'd spent so long being miserable, working long hours, coming home to a quiet house, dealing with my sister's attitude, that I think he just hit a breaking point. He accepted that mom wasn't coming back. She cheated, she'd left, and that was it. He stopped staring at old photos of her and started talking about the future instead. It wasn't a big announcement or anything, he just started acting like a person again. Then he met someone. Her name was Lisa, a co-worker from his office. She was nice, quiet, nothing like mom. They started going out for coffee, then dinners. He didn't bring her around us at first, probably because he didn't want to deal with my sister's reaction. But I could tell he liked her. He'd come home a little less tired, even smile sometimes. It was the first time in years I'd seen him look hopeful. I was happy for him. He deserved something good after everything. Eventually, he told us about her. He sat us down one night and said he'd been seeing someone and wanted to know how we felt about it. I said it was fine, that he should do what makes him happy. My sister didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, arms crossed, staring at the floor. Then she got up and walked to her room without a word. I figured she'd get over it. She was always moody, but I was wrong. She didn't like that dad was moving on. To her, it was like he was giving up on mom for good, and she couldn't stand that. That's when she started causing real problems. It didn't take long for my sister to start messing with dad's relationship. Lisa came over for dinner one night, just a casual thing to meet us. Dad made spaghetti, and I helped set the table. Lisa was polite, asked us about school, tried to make small talk. I could tell she was nervous but wanted to make a good impression. I liked her well enough, she didn't try too hard or act fake. My sister, though? She barely looked up from her plate the whole time. She answered Lisa's questions with one-word grunts and left the table as soon as she could. A few days later, Dad told me Lisa had called him upset. Apparently, my sister had found her on Facebook and sent her a message. She told Lisa that Dad was a womanizer, that he'd cheated on Mom a bunch of times and couldn't be trusted. None of it was true. Dad was the most loyal guy I'd ever seen, but Lisa didn't know that. She just heard this random story from his daughter and freaked out. Dad had to spend hours explaining it wasn't real, showing her old texts from Mom to prove he wasn't the bad guy. Lisa stayed with him, but you could tell she was shaken. That wasn't the end of it. Every time Dad dated someone new after that, Lisa didn't last long. My sister pulled the same stunt. She tracked them down online, called them if she got their number, and feed them lies. He's a tyrant, he's controlling, he'll ruin your life, whatever she could think of. Most of the women didn't stick around to find out the truth. Dad's relationships kept falling apart, and I could see him getting more frustrated each time. After a few failed relationships, Dad started getting fed up. He'd been patient with my sister for years, letting her attitude slide, trying to talk to her calmly even when she ignored him, but this was different. She wasn't just disrespecting him anymore, she was actively ruining his chances at being happy. I'd hear him pacing in the kitchen late at night, muttering to himself about how he couldn't keep doing this. He wanted a fresh start, but she wouldn't let him have it. He tried talking to her about it once. I was in the living room, pretending to do homework, but I heard everything. He asked why she kept lying to these women, why she couldn't let him move on. She didn't give him a straight answer, just said he didn't deserve to be happy after what happened with Mom. That hit him hard. He didn't yell or argue back, he just walked away, shoulders slumped. I think that's when he realized she wasn't going to change on her own. He started wondering if it was his fault somehow, if he'd messed up raising her after Mom left. He'd always tried to be fair, to keep us fed and safe, but maybe that wasn't enough. My sister's grudge was deeper than he thought, and he didn't know how to fix it. She wasn't a little kid anymore, she was 16 by then, old enough to know what she was doing. Her lies weren't just tantrums, they were calculated. Dad couldn't ignore it anymore. He needed help, and he didn't have many options left. Dad eventually decided he couldn't handle my sister alone anymore. He figured if she was so hung up on Mom, maybe Mom could talk some sense into her. It wasn't an easy choice. He hadn't spoken to her much since she left, just short calls about logistics like picking up old stuff she'd left behind. But he swallowed his pride and invited her over. I was surprised she even agreed. She'd been living her own life, dating some guy, acting like we didn't exist. Still, she showed up one Saturday afternoon. She looked different, new haircut, flashy clothes, like she was trying to prove she'd moved on. Dad sat her down with my sister in the living room. He explained what had been happening, how my sister kept sabotaging his relationships, the lies she'd been telling. He asked Mom to help, to tell her the truth about what happened between them so she'd stop blaming him. I stayed out of sight, listening from the hallway. I thought maybe this could fix things, or at least make my sister see reality. It didn't go that way. Instead of backing Dad up, Mom made everything worse. She started telling my sister these wild stories, how Dad had been controlling during their marriage, how he'd driven her away with his temper. None of it was true. I'd lived through it. Dad was the one keeping things together while she was off cheating. But Mom didn't care about the truth. She spun this whole narrative, and my sister ate it up. By the time Mom left, my sister was glaring at Dad like he was a monster. He just sat there, stunned, realizing he'd made a huge mistake. After Mom's visit, things got even uglier. My sister didn't just dislike Dad anymore, she acted like she hated him. Mom's lies had poured fuel on the fire, and now she was convinced he was the villain in every story. She stopped pretending to follow his rules altogether. She'd stay out late without telling him where she was, skip school, and ignore him when he tried to ask what was going on. The house felt like a war zone, except no one was yelling, just this thick, heavy silence between them. She started saying she wanted to live with Mom instead. She'd bring it up every chance she got, telling Dad she couldn't stand being around him anymore. She'd pack a bag sometimes, like she was serious, and sit by the door waiting for him to cave. He didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to let her go just to end the fighting, but he was still her dad. He couldn't give up on her that easily. So he called Mom again, asked if she'd take her for a while, maybe straighten her out. Mom came over a second time, and I watched from upstairs. My sister begged her to let her move in, saying she'd be happier there. Mom just laughed, actually laughed in her face. She said she didn't want kids dragging her down, that she was finally free and wasn't about to ruin that. Then she walked out, leaving my sister standing there with her bag. It was brutal. I thought maybe that would snap her out of it, make her see Mom didn't care about us. But it didn't. She just turned all that hurt back on Dad, like he'd somehow caused it. After Mom rejected her, my sister didn't soften up like I'd hoped. She didn't cry or rethink anything, she just got angrier. It was like she couldn't handle being wrong about Mom, so she doubled down on hating Dad instead. He became the punching bag for everything, Mom leaving, Mom not wanting her, all of it. She stopped even pretending to get along with him. If he asked her to do something, she'd glare at him and walk away. If he tried to talk, she'd put in her earbuds and turn up the music. She kept up the sabotage too. Dad hadn't dated anyone in a while. He was too worn out, but when he finally tried again, she was ready. He met a woman named Karen at a work event, and they hit it off. She came over once, and my sister pulled the same old tricks. She told Karen that Dad was abusive, that he made Mom's life miserable. Karen didn't buy it completely. She asked Dad about it later, but it still put a strain on things. He had to spend weeks convincing her it wasn't true, and even then, she pulled back. They stopped seeing each other not long after. Dad was exhausted by then. I could see it in his face. He'd aged years in just a few months. He didn't know how to reach my sister anymore. She was 17 now, almost an adult, but still acting like a kid throwing a tantrum. Her hate had turned into this solid wall between them, and nothing he did could break it down. I started wondering how long we could all keep living like this, with her tearing him apart every chance she got. My sister's hate for Dad never let up. She turned 18 a few months ago, and the day after her birthday, she moved out. She didn't tell us where she was going, just packed her stuff and left. Dad didn't try to stop her. He was too tired, and I think he figured she'd be better off figuring things out on her own. I haven't heard from her since, and neither has he. She cut us both off completely. Dad stopped dating after that last mess with Karen. He doesn't talk about it, but I can tell he's given up on finding someone. He goes to work, comes home, and sits in front of the TV. The house is quiet now, no fights, no tension, just empty. I'm still here, finishing school, but I'll be out soon too. He'll be alone then, and I don't know how he'll handle it. Mom's still out there, living her life. She doesn't call or check in. My sister probably still idolizes her, even after everything. I don't get it, how she can ignore what Mom did and keep blaming Dad. He's not perfect, but he didn't deserve this. Years of trying to hold us together, and all he got was a daughter who hates him and a son who can't fix it. That's where it ends, I guess. A family that fell apart, and no one's coming back to put it together.